Anthony Chadwick from the Webinar Vet. I've been conscious that obviously the coronavirus problem is, and I felt it was useful for somebody just to take a look at all the research out there, all the news. There is a danger that, you know, there's so much news. In fact, they were saying in South Korea, people are getting, you know, so scared by all the news out there that I felt it was a useful time for us to look at the situation, what we need to know specifically in veterinary practice, and then take things from there. So just if we look at the agenda, I'm going to talk first of all about the coronavirus history and clinical science, then talk about the situation abroad, which is ahead of us in the curve, what's happening in the UK at the moment. There seems to be a bit of controversy. Can pets be involved in this? So I'm going to talk a little bit around that as well. Where I maybe see the future going within the UK, and then spending some time on what happens to veterinary practice if there's a big outbreak and how that can be dealt with. In typical American fashion, I think you have to put a disclaimer on this because this is a very fast-moving situation. I've put this information together by consulting trusted sources, including some medical friends, but this information is really given as a guide. You know, when the government is struggling with it, then obviously there isn't complete certainty in this. But I hope that this webinar will be useful for you. So COVID-19, probably don't remember New Year's Eve, China alerted WHO to several unusual cases of pneumonia in Wuhan, a port city, 11 million people in China. I mean, these places are incredibly large. The biggest city, you know, in UK is 8-9 million in London. So this is a city that we've probably never heard of before, but has 11 million people in it. And very, very quickly, and this is the benefit, I think, of technology now, we took 2 years to really work out what AIDS was. And yet within a week, 2 weeks of really being aware of this, I think obviously there was things happening in China before the 31st of December, but very quickly it was recognized as being a coronavirus, a new variant, 2019 nCoV as it was called then, obviously COVID-19 now. And then on the 9th of January, there was the first death. And this person, they thought had caught it from a fish market where there was also sales of live animals as well. And I think there is some controversy about where it actually crossed over from, but there is a feeling it's probably been bats, possibly pangolins, possibly pigs, but it has crossed over from those species. And we can see a little bit of a coronavirus timeline there. I will be putting these slides up on SlideShare on LinkedIn. So, you know, you will obviously have the recording, but if you find that the PowerPoint is useful, do just go to SlideShare on LinkedIn on my profile and you'll be able to find it. On the 23rd of January, the city of Wuhan was placed under quarantine because they were getting so worried about this particular disease. And by the 9th of February, it had already surpassed the death toll from the SARS epidemic in 2002. And, you know, we've now got well over 100,000 people who've been infected, with approximately around about 3,500 to 4,000 people who unfortunately have died. And you may have seen, obviously, just the other day that Italy has now been placed in lockdown because obviously the disease has spread from China, first of all, you know, to places like the Philippines, South Korea. South Korea was the second most populous place with coronavirus, but Italy has just taken over and is now in second place behind China. So COVID-19 is a coronavirus, which is an RNA virus. And many of you will know that the coronavirus is implicated in the common cold. A mild infection usually takes about a week to get over, and you know, really there's no mortality from that virus. But also there was the Middle Eastern acute respiratory syndrome virus, and obviously also the South Asian respiratory syndrome virus, which happened at the beginning of this century, causing deaths, but were fairly quickly snuffed out. So they didn't seem to be quite as infectious as COVID-19 is. And obviously, I know you're aware that the feline infectious peritonitis virus is a coronavirus. And the researchers at Liverpool University always felt that canine coronavirus was an important virus, potentially causing gastroenteritis type signs, maybe even exacerbating parvovirus, and was in fact put in some vaccines, dog vaccines, as part of the cocktail of viruses that we protect our dogs against. So, we'll all know and have heard of the coronavirus, and of course, called corona because when you look at it under the electron microscope, it looks like a crown. So that's where the terminology comes from. And you can see it's a pleomorphic enveloped particles. The envelope is studded with projecting glycoproteins and surrounds a core consisting of matrix protein enclosed within which is a single strand of positive sense RNA. So an RNA virus, and you can see that sort of studded glycoproteins that are on the outside of the envelope. And then if you want to look at it more schematically, and we'll have all seen photographs of this in our papers, in our news reports as well. This is COVID-19. Can coronavirus mutate? The worry is that it can mutate. There's already been 2 strains seen. We obviously have no vaccine against this, but like the influenza virus, which does mutate, coronavirus does seem as if it has that potential as well. And there are 2 strains, the L strain and the S strain. The S was the original strain, was milder and less infectious, but quite quickly an L strain has emerged, which spreads quickly and is now 70% of the cases. So it's a more infectious organism and has obviously had a zoonotic spread. So first of all, those first cases were coming from animal to human, but obviously we've now also developed into human to human spread. Clinical signs, this is a respiratory disease. For many people, it is quite a mild disease, but unfortunately, in the more severe cases, pneumonia develops, there is dyspnea, difficulty in breathing, and this is the difference between influenza and coronavirus, that you get this shortness of breath in the coronavirus that is not seen commonly with influenza. Severe cough, we also see liver and kidney failure as well, and we think it's spread via droplets in the cough, but also by touching infected surfaces. So if people are coughing, they cough on the table, unless that's removed, people can obviously catch that from the droplets containing the virus, and they can remain on the surface for a while unless they're cleaned away. So this disease has obviously spread very quickly across the world, seen in most places. Obviously, some places are better at reporting than others, which may explain some of the places where the map is blank. But it is clearly spreading quickly around the world. Some key statistics, these were from the 3rd of March. WHO was saying that the death rate from this disease was about 3.4%. In South Korea, it was about 0.6%, and in the USA, it was 5%. And when I looked at these figures, what they showed was the fact that South Korea have been very, very good, and they're the model that we should follow. They've been very, very good at testing people very early on. So they've tested many, many more people than the USA have. The USA, up until recently, all of the testing had to be done at their CDC center, the Center for Disease Control. They had a shortage of tests. And in fact, there was a report of one person who they thought had coronavirus, and they took 4 days before they had a test to be able to test them. In South Korea, they're actually having drive-throughs where you can drive through, take a test. Within half an hour, you have a result. In America, up until recently, it would take 2 days to get the test results back. If you can very quickly work out who is infectious and get them to go into quarantine, then they are much less likely to spread the disease to other people. So those figures have developed over time. And we're now seeing a situation that the sort of 3 top countries are probably China, Iran, and Italy. And China's death rate has been about 3.9%. Iran's has been about 3.3%, and Italy at the moment is standing at about 5%. And I think part of the reason for that is in China, they've been able to put some very draconian measures in very quickly. It's obviously, a totalitarian state. The people do, on the whole, what they're asked to do. And so people have been put into isolation. Obviously in Italy, I think there's been a lot of spread of people moving around. When they were hearing that quarantine was coming in, they were jumping on trains. And I think this has created, unfortunately, a problem where there are, unfortunately, quite a lot of deaths. And now, of course, Italy is in lockdown. So South Korea is showing about a 0.6, 0.7 death rate. And I think it's because they are testing many more people. They're also seeing that those very mild cases that perhaps wouldn't be included in those numbers are then included in the number, but they're also allowing people to go and isolate themselves quickly. So, 3.4% is quite a scary number. I think that we'll find that the UK average will be much lower than that. At the moment, the figures are there have been 5 deaths from 319 confirmed cases, which is about 1.6% death rate. Obviously, sadly, the older you are, the more likely you are to die from this disease. Young people under 40, basically, you're very, very unfortunate if you do pass away with it. But if you're over 80 and you get the disease, at the moment, the percentage seems to be about 15%. In China, they seem to think that there was a sex imbalance, 4.7% for males, 2.8% for females, so quite a big difference. But that was also put down to the fact that many, many more men in China smoke than women do. And they thought that this might cause it due to the damage to the lungs due to smoking. But 80% of cases are mild. So this is, for the most people, a mild disease. But unfortunately, for people who are older, it's more serious. And you can see the situation in Iran taken from a website that I found. You can see that this is becoming quite exponential there. Again, I think the key points are being able to isolate, having the medicines available, the national health service that you have. We're very fortunate in the UK, it's free at the point of use. In America, it isn't. That will probably have some effects on how quickly people will go in and have themselves checked. Pre-existing conditions, if you have cardiovascular disease, if you have diabetes, hypertension, chronic respiratory disease, so hence, if you smoke a lot, you get COPD, and of course cancer, all of these make it much more likely that you would potentially die from the disease. How infectious is it? We look in microbiology with viruses at a reproductive number. How likely is this disease to spread from person to person? And flu is usually between 1 and 2. And that means that if a person has flu, they're most likely to pass it on to 1 or 2 other people. I think that the number I'm quoting you there at 2.28 is from a scientific paper which looked at the spread of the disease over the Diamond Princess, which was the cruise liner that was in Japan. you know, if you wanted to have a really good place to experiment on this book, sticking people on a cruise liner and keeping them on there for a long time was a great way of doing it. A lot of shared air conditioning that is recycling air all over the boat. And I think it's made it much more likely that people would catch the disease on the boat than if they'd been taken off. And in fact, there's now another cruise liner that's in San Francisco, and I know those people are being taken off a lot quicker because I think they've already learned the lessons from the Diamond Princess, which was that the people were left on the cruise liner for far too long. So again, I think that reproductive number will probably come down, and it will probably be a similar sort of infectious level that that influenza has as well. The situation in Italy is really quite dire at the moment. There were 6 infections on the 21st of February. By the 27th, there were 650 infections and 17 deaths. By March the 3rd, there were 77 deaths. And about the 8th of March, Italy was placed into lockdown. There's now been the most up-to-date figure as of today is 463 deaths. And there's been 9,000 people, 9,172 confirmed with the disease. So that is a death rate of 5%, which is really high. And I think the health service in Italy is not coping with this because the disease has come very quickly. And listening to our chief medical officer, Professor Whitty, he's talked a lot about trying to make the curve flatter so that we spend longer before we really go into a full-blown epidemic. It's interesting that the situation in China now, with those very, very strong draconian measures that they've put in, that the numbers of cases seem to be decreasing. So that's sort of 2.5 months in, which is the sort of numbers that, again, Professor Whitty has been suggesting for an epidemic, in that it probably takes about 50% of all cases will happen in 3 weeks, and then 95% of cases will happen over the 9-week period. So China look as if they're coming towards the end of that. I think if it can be spread out, it also allows people to have those strict measures to hopefully slow down and prevent many more people getting the disease. If we can kind of let the disease burn itself out, hopefully less people will be affected than the government has suggested. Their worst case scenario is 80% of our population could be infected by the virus. I think reading around the situation, talking to medical colleagues, I think that is a really, really worst case scenario, and we've got to be careful that we're not scaring people with those numbers. So we're fortunate we've got a really strong leader in the UK called Professor Whitty, the man on the right, not on the left. And we've already tested about 25,000 people. So similarly to Korea, we're testing a lot of people already. And so far, we've had those 319 positives with, unfortunately, 5 deaths. I think all of those deaths have happened in older people with pre-existing conditions. But, you know, clearly every death is a really sad case. So the NHS have set up really a 4-pronged attack on this disease. They've talked about containment, delay, research and mitigation. And I think we're moving out of the first stage of containment into delay. And delay, I think there are a number of strategies that the NHS is using to flatten the curve, to make sure that it doesn't happen very, very quickly. It doesn't happen exponentially, where if there was a large number of cases, of course, there would be a large number of cases that were more critical, and there may not be the beds and the respirators to actually support those people. And that's why we're perhaps seeing higher death rates in places like Iran, where perhaps the equipment isn't quite at our level. So what is the NHS advice? Again, speaking to one of my doctor friends, it was interesting that what they're asking at this point, and of course, I think this will change quite quickly, But if you have a cough, a cold, you're feeling fluey, you're perhaps having difficulty breathing. My wife had somebody in the school yesterday who, one of the cleaners, who was coughing and spluttering. And she'd rung up the doctors, and the doctors hadn't really given her the right advice. The right advice is that you, one, shouldn't immediately go into your place of work. You should ring 111, which is the NHS telephone advice service. And they will almost certainly, with those sort of symptoms that I've just described, would be recommending that you got tested. And that would then be organised so that a test kit was provided for you to test yourself. Or I think people are actually being tested. So I presume that the test is then left outside and somebody then goes on and tests it. If the person comes back as positive, they will then be given advice on medical treatment. I think the standard treatment for people who don't get particularly unwell is going to be, paracetamol, plenty of fluid, Bufren if you need it as well. But the self-isolation is important, and they're talking about, 2 weeks isolating yourself from others if you, are tested positive for the coronavirus. I think why they're not immediately giving out medical advice, if you look on the websites, that's not present, is because they want people to be tested. At some point, testing will stop as they see that the disease is going more mainstream. But I think it's really important that if people are tested, they know that they're positive and they isolate. That will make it much less likely that the disease will be spread, to other people. The NHS advice, how can you prevent the spread? Regular hand washing is the big one that they're talking about. Soap is better than sanitizer. So, you should be using soap. Obviously, sanitizer is the thing that's actually run out in the shops. But the best thing to do is just to wash your hands regularly. Obviously, after having washed your hands, don't be placing your hands over your face a lot. All of us touch, as we look at this. I was watching one of the football managers on the television. We all touch our faces quite a lot, and it's something that we should try and reduce, certainly at this time. And certainly reducing physical contact with other people. So in my church, we're not giving out the sign of peace at the moment. We're not shaking each other's hands. So there's certain things like that. And then obviously, I think particularly for veterinary practice, we should be really upping the ante on regular cleaning of communal spaces. What will the future hold? Inevitably, there is going to be more and more pressure on the NHS. And I think it was great to hear from the Professor Whitty that, the NHS is able to flex in these situations. But clearly, if we can flatten that curve, then it's a more manageable situation if people are becoming ill over the next 2 months than if it's over the next 2 weeks. So this self-isolation, I think, is really important. We are hearing of cases going into a GP's. That GP's is then closed. It's deep cleaned before it's opened again. So there have been cases of that. Some schools, I know a few schools had gone to Italy for skiing. They're coming back again. They need to probably be isolated and wait and see if they develop the disease. Disease, I think people are saying, is somewhere between 7 and 14 days before it comes out. But I think 7 is the more accurate number. So if you catch the disease, it's likely within 7 days that you will be showing symptoms. Clearly, if we're inside in a pub, in a restaurant, in a cinema, people are coughing around us, that air is shared, in one space. It's much better at this point to be out and about. And this is one of the controversies, again, that Professor Whitty has broached about stopping sporting events or playing them behind closed doors. If Liverpool's match goes on and the fans are not allowed in, they probably will congregate in pubs around the city. A pub is probably a less safe place than being in an open plan stadium. And I think, of course, we have to worry about food and supply shortages. There has been some panic buying on things like sanitizers, but having gone into the supermarket, you know, they still seem to be well stocked. And one of the benefits or advantages of Brexit is that we obviously, as a country, had stockpiled somewhat, worrying about, you know, a no deal Brexit. Can pets catch coronavirus? There has been a case in Hong Kong of a Pomeranian that tested weekly positive for this disease. It has stayed as positive, but I think this has probably been caught from the owner, so it's a reverse zoonoses. There's no evidence, even with previous outbreaks of SARS and MERS, that the disease really would spread to other animals or back to people. So I think it's something that we shouldn't be worried about. People will ask us. Understanding some of the
Anthony, you're just breaking up a little bit, so I'm not sure whether you want to dial in.
Yeah, I'll go on the. Just give me a second.
Yeah, just bear with us, please, while Anthony dials in, just so make sure the sound quality remains good.
Is that better, Rich?
Perfect, yeah.
Okay, that's super. So, my understanding is that if people have the coronavirus infection and they've got pets in the house, there is some information that's suggesting that the pets, that we should tell people that we have pets in the house and they may get tested. But my own feeling is that this probably will not be a problem. But again, watch this space. At the moment, just one case, weekly positive. The pet showed absolutely no clinical signs. So the pet was very much asymptomatic. But what could happen in veterinary practice? I think there is a danger that fewer pets being brought to the practice. We're seeing it, you know, with people are not flying, they're perhaps not going, you know, to the cinema as much. You know, people are changing their behavior somewhat. And there is a worry, I think, with the economic effect that the virus will have, that, you know, some businesses will really struggle and may close down. So I think that's certainly a worry that, you know, if there was an outbreak in a practice, that obviously the practice can't really function then. If there is a staff illness, of course, that person should be encouraged to self-isolate. They may not be very unwell. They may just have 1 or 2 days of being unwell, or they may be asymptomatic, but they will need to be tested, and perhaps to also test the other areas as well. Are you still hearing me okay, Rich?
Yeah, we can hear you, but we've lost your presentation. Do you want me to share the screen?
Yeah, if you share the screen for me, please. We're just on what could happen in veterinary practice.
Yeah, no problem.
Of course, if clients come in and, you know, are ill, they won't be able to come into the practice either. There may be a shortage of drugs. I know I saw some information from MWI yesterday which suggested that there aren't any drug shortages at the moment, but deliveries could be curtailed. It may be worth just looking at the essentials vaccines that you are, you know, well stocked up. And of course, if a practice does have an infection within it, it probably will need to be closed, and then deep cleans and such like will have to happen. So just let me get my slides up properly, because I just can't spot the bottom of the slide. Just give me 1 second. So suggested actions. I would advise that it's well worth holding a meeting as soon as possible to inform teams of the steps you are taking. It's really important that people understand this. Some will understand it more than others. Some will have been reading lots. There is misinformation out there, so it's important that you're reading the right sources. SPIVs have actually done, and BVA have done, some really good information sheets on this, and have even done, SPIVs has even done a PowerPoint to give, you know, out to your team. And I've left those as a resource on the end slide, which we can put up at the end. And obviously we can share this with you later. So I would very much advise that you hold a meeting now. We've already held a meeting, and we decided as a digital business, and I think you know, I remember the ex-CEO of the Royal College saying every business needs to be a digital business, and this was 3 or 4 years ago. Even more so now, you need to be able to have a digital offering. And so our business is obviously very digital. We've decided to leave the office at the moment to work from home to make sure that we can run things efficiently, albeit with a slightly dodgy internet today. But this is the way to test things out before perhaps the disease, hits more fully. I think this is the time to really be cleaning the practice. Obviously, most veterinary practices are impeccably clean anyway, but it probably is a time when we should even up the ante on the cleaning as well. If you've got that ability to arrange delivery services, people may not want to come into your practice, so you can offer them the fact that you can send the drugs out to them. You can have a delivery service. They're all going to be in your local area, so you could have one of your nurses perhaps going out, or another member of staff to deliver drugs, so that people, especially older people, don't need to come into a building where there are more people and they're worried about catching infection. And I think also there is that option of using telemedicine. I've been talking to a telemedicine provider in Canada that's unusual in that it develops it for the practices. I think there's a lot of controversy around telemedicine in the UK, and part of that is because it's seen as being, an external company coming in, providing this service without providing the more difficult, day-to-day service as well. And quite rightly, I had my own practice. Many of you will be listening, work in a practice. I think it's something that practices should have the ability to do as well. This is where I talk about, practices being digital businesses, communicating these messages to their clients on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, but also being able to perhaps potentially have consults with sick clients, older clients who don't want to come out, perhaps using a vet who has had the virus but has to isolate himself or herself for 2 weeks. They can then be used in the telemedicine service. So I hope this has helped. My own sort of final feelings on this is that, of course, it's a serious disease. I think we are probably dealing with it in an appropriate way in the UK. I think we've got a fantastic chief medical officer who seems to be really on the ball about it. Having said that, I think there is always a worry with all this information that we become very afraid, we get very worried. Some bright spark told me that the Bible has 365 times it says, do not be afraid, do not worry. Worry doesn't get us anywhere. If we're going to get the virus, we're going to get it. We can obviously put measures in place to try and make that less likely. But the likelihood is that for most people, this is a mild disease. They may be even asymptomatic, or they'll be unwell for 2 or 3 days and then better again. So in as much as it's a serious disease, I don't want you to worry. I certainly don't want you to panic. Don't panic. Carry a towel and maybe a little bit of soap as well. And I'm hoping that that will keep us all safe and well.